Hello, and welcome to Seafood Matters Podcast, the voice of the UK seafood industry. I'm your host, Jim Cowie, and in this episode, I am talking with Andrew Mallison. Andrew is a marine scientist. We will be chatting about current issues facing the UK fishing industry, marine habitat, and sea creatures.
Thanks for the invitation to come and talk to you today. Looking forward to a great discussion. Our little chat earlier, you're a fellow seafood lover, as I am, so I'm sure there'll be lots to talk about. I've been in the seafood industry all my life. I started off wanting to do marine biology and thought that was a little bit too academic, so I ended up doing a fishery science degree in Plymouth in the UK. After graduating, rather than staying on to do something further in education, I had a chance of traveling to Australia to work for a big seafood company out there. And I've been in the seafood industry ever since, different countries around the world. I now live in the USA. I progressed through my career doing all sorts of things, technical, commercial, to CEO and board level. And I sort of semi-retired from a CEO position a couple of years ago to start my own consultancy, fishthink.com. So that's basically where I am today.
I think one very noticeable omission to that is I think maybe I want to ask you to tell our listeners a little bit about what's the catch.
Okay. The snappily named title of my self-published book, available on Amazon. What's the catch? I had collected over many years little snippets of information as I learned them. I had the good fortune to spend 13 years, I think it was, at Marks and Spencer, the last few of them being head of their procurement for all the seafood that they sourced from around the world. And it was a great job. Try and find the best of every type of commercial species. So I met some amazing suppliers, both fishermen and fish farmers, people who are really committed and dedicated to the best seafood that they knew how to catch or harvest or farm. And over those years, sitting on airplanes and, when you have those down times waiting for travel, I'd write down some notes about what it is that made the best cod or made the best flatfish or the best shrimp, whatever, because you don't know how good it can be until you try something that really blows your socks off. And I remember sitting in a restaurant in Hertzels in Denmark, swearing that this fish on a plate in front of me was not plaice. It could not be plaice. It just tasted so good, it was more like a turbot. And the chef actually came out and said, well, thank you very much for the compliment. It was bought fresh this morning from the auction. If you'd like to come and look in the fridge in the kitchen, you'll see 10 more of them, which I did. And there they were, nice orange spotted little beasties, amazing quality fish. And so I thought, partly for my own, memoirs, partly for my own satisfaction, partly to tell my family what I did in all those days and weeks that I was away traveling, I would write some of it down. And when I had the time, which was a year or two ago, I pulled together some of them. I added a little bit to it to try and make it into a book. It's now in its second edition. And it, from my perspective anyway, talks about what I think is the best of each of those familiar popular species. Happy to debate that with you, Jim. I know you've got some different opinions to mine in some areas. But from my point of view, what I have experienced so far to be the best and what makes it the best. And then also maybe to take a bit of time talking about some of the bigger issues in the industry like sustainability and the politics of fishing. So that's what the book's all about. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about it.
Andrew, if I was to say one thing, you mentioned there my take on it. If you don't mind me, I'll give you my take on it.
Please do.
I would say to every one of our listeners, go out and buy it.
Thank you. That's very kind.
Seriously, What's the Catch is the name of the book. Go out and buy it. There's only one other book, Andrew, that I would say is in the class of your one. And it's a good friend of mine many years ago, a guy, Ian McAndrew, absolute top of his game, a brilliant chef, and it's very much from a chef point of view, and it's recipes. So it's a cookbook, and it's called A Feast of Fish. And I still, to this day, would say, as far as a cookbook is concerned, that is the best I've come across. Feast of Fish. And from a seafood point of view, it's an amazing book. And I put your one in that category. And trying to look beyond and into, let's say, through the pages, trying to look in your mind. The thing that really throws me, it does not read like a book from a fisheries scientist. I feel that you're very descriptive, spot on, but very much in a basis that you don't go, you just give it what it is, say what it is, and you move on. It's not gone into the science of it and complicated, and people get lost in the midst of it. I think it's really fantastic. And really, if somebody wants to know about fish, seasons and things, it's an absolute must. I think it's fantastic, and it's very thorough, although it's not gone into, things like, Megrim sole, which is a fish I use a lot. It ticks all the sustainable boxes. But although it's a sole, it's a flat fish, it's a member of the turbot family. And I thought, good on you. I wondered if that was going to come, and it did.
MTB, Megrim, Turbot and Brill.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, brill, I feel, is very much, it's an amazing fish.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's very kind, Jim. Thank you. And I know you run a great restaurant, so that's praise indeed. And I didn't want to. I'm not qualified. I'm not a chef, and I take my hat off to people who cook for a living professionally and prepare amazing meals for their customers to enjoy. But what I tried to do, and having had the good fortune to work with a couple of chefs like Tom Akins and Mitch Tonks, I know they always have this hunger for information about what it is, the ingredient. Obviously, great food only comes from great ingredients. And I think there are lots of great cookbooks out there, but there seem to me, anyway, to be very few about the ingredient, the fish itself. How do you choose great fish? What makes it great? And so that's what partly drove me to think, well, I'll make a book out of this. I'll maybe share that knowledge. And people who are interested in seafood, maybe they're amateur chefs, maybe they're professional chefs, and want to understand some of the questions they maybe should be asking of their supplier, some of the seasonality aspects, some of the differences between farmed and wild. This maybe would be helpful to them. But thank you for the kind words, and I hope people who do have a passion for seafood, in the way that many people have a love of wine and they want to read the back of the bottle about how it was grown, the wine was produced, will get something from the book along the same lines, that background knowledge, the backstory of what made it great.
Absolutely. No, I think I'm not all the way through it yet, but I'm greatly impressed. And okay, it's not a chef. You're not a chef, as you say, and it's not got a sort of chef sort of background, but you certainly don't leave any question of doubt as to what the capabilities of the fish and the dish to make with it. I think it's fantastic.
Thank you. I mean, the curious thing is when you go to some seafood processing plants, and it might be in Iceland or Alaska or other side of the world, it's just a material sometimes to those plants. And I would remember going to a factory and saying, do you actually sample, do you taste this fish? And they said, well, no, we don't need to really. You know, we know it's fresh. We know when it was caught. We fillet it. We make sure the bones are out. We look at the portion control, and the weight size, and so on. But no, we don't need to eat it. And there's always been this bit of a disconnect about when does the fish become food? And something I always try to push is that if that fish is in some way substandard because it's post spawning, or maybe it's been contaminated by a bit of diesel, who knows? You better be finding that out now rather than sending it in to your customer and having it returned. And understand yourself, you know, you as the primary processor should be the expert in that raw material, and as with the fishermen. So it's seeing the fish as food, and I know we've come a long way in auctions to standing on boxes of fish and smoking over them, and at the auction, fortunately, it's a lot more hygienic these days. But there's still a little bit of consciousness to be brought in as to when that fish becomes food. I mean, it always is food. As soon as it comes into your net or your hook, it's food for somebody's table.
I couldn't agree with you more. Even from the chef's point of view, one of the things I feel the colleges should do a bit more is encourage. To me, cooking. Oh, it doesn't matter how good a chef you are. Cooking is all about tasting. And any dish a chef is putting out, and I'm the same in my kitchen, I encourage people to eat our food, our staff, because they need to know, they need to know what it tastes like. Just gives you an inner confidence, I feel. But one of the things that I would ask you a wee bit more on, Andrew, which is an absolutely relative and important point to the fish and the quality, the eating of it, is when you brushed on the point of the processor, maybe it's at the point of the season and spawning. Could you elaborate a bit, let our listeners know just exactly, because it's very much a seasonal product, and it's in their seasons, in season and out of season.
Sure, sure. Well, the fish have a cycle. I mean, let's talk about wild. We'll start off now. Obviously, with farming, you can manipulate that cycle somewhat, but the natural cycle of a fish, once it reaches, it's from adolescence, it's growing to a point. You have catch regulations and so on about minimum sizes, but let's say it's a harvestable fish. Now it's going to continue growing until it reaches maturity, and at that point, it'll enter a cycle of starting to spawn. In the northern hemisphere, it's going to be that sort of January, February time, because then the larvae have the spring, the warming water, the better availability of food, and the best chance of survival and growth. So different fish are affected in different ways by that spawning event at the beginning of the year. Some are badly affected. They take a huge amount of energy, and flatfish, particularly plaice specifically, it just turns to like a watery jelly around February, March time, or when it's spawning, I should say, because spawning is triggered by water temperatures. So spawning will start, let's say, further in the south, in the UK, for example, in the English Channel, and then that spawning will start to occur further up into the North Sea and the North Atlantic. So you can dodge a little bit the spawning seasons by knowing that, okay, spawning started in the south of the UK, so we'll buy our fish in Peterhead or a northern port where they haven't started spawning yet because the temperatures of the water are still a little lower. Getting a bit technical now, but that's what triggers it. And the good fish buyers will know, looking at the fish, whether they're approaching the size of the roe, if they're about to spawn, and we'll be seeing that. Because not only does, from the consumer point of view, the eating quality suffer, but the yield suffers. So you don't get so much of a big fat fillet off a fish that's just post spawning, because it's used up a lot of its energy in producing sperm or eggs for spawning. So it then recovers. There'll be a recovery period into the summer, and the quality of the fish may be better during the summer than earlier in the year. Let's say some fish are affected more than others, and there is a regional aspect to this as well. So you really have to know what you're buying as a restaurant owner, which merchants to be working with, having a geographic spread to try and minimize the impact on your supply.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so true from every point along the way. The timing, and I've spoken to quite a lot of people around the coastline about this, and there's very little difference actually between people I've spoken to in Devon, Cornwall, and fishing the Channel. We're only talking about within the whole British Isles, maybe a two maybe 3 months difference in the cycle, and we always, as we're reaching this stage of maybe April, when we're hoping they'll start to fatten up. They've already spawned and lost all their condition and their weight, and we're looking at them picking up again, fattening up. We always think the further north you go, the better, because up by Shetland, northwest Shetland into the Faroes, it's a much later spawning time, and obviously from what you say there, that's dictated by water temperature.
Yep. Yes. So that you've got this annual cycle of spawning, recovery, fattening up, preparation again. Then for the next spawning cycle, you've also got a big variation in the fatty fish, the mackerels, herrings, and so on. A big variation in oil levels, and that will vary during the year as oil builds up, and the fat of mackerel can double from 15% to 30% during the year. So there is a variability, and part of it, that's the fun of it, to try and think, well, maybe that's not quite the right time to buy this particular fish. I'll buy something else instead. And I know you have an interest in talking about alternative species, and maybe that creates some windows and incentive for trying something a bit different, because your favorite fish may not be the best time of year for it.
That's exactly what I always say to people at demonstrations and things like that. Don't just stick with this one species. There's a fish, another way I put it, a fish for every dish and a dish for every season. All the fish are not in the same spawning cycle. Ling are much later than haddock, for example. And hake are later. Sole is different. Lemon sole are different from Megram sole.
Yeah, and I think that's an amazing quality in a great restaurant for the seafood lover who wants to go and learn something, to say, well, what have you got? What's your seasonal special right this week, or this month? Because I'd love to try something different, and be guided by the expertise of the restaurant, because they know the variability during the year, and they've picked from the best of the market on that morning maybe. And having those surprise choices, because obviously I love cod and haddock, but if that's all you ever ate, you'd be missing out on a lot of other beautiful tasting fish.
One of the things I was mostly taken by yourself is the fact that although it's not what you would expect scientists to be that way minded, but you are really strong on flavour and taste. And I think, well, and obviously in an eating experience, that's what it's all about.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe I wasn't a very good scientist. Maybe I went into that sort of science and technical area, but once I had graduated, I realized that I wasn't really cut out for standing on a cold fish dock measuring sizes of fish and checking maturity levels or doing statistical analysis of biomass. It didn't really thrill me. What I loved was seeing the real deal, seeing it being caught, seeing it being processed, and getting to somebody's table. And I have to thank Marks and Spencer for training me and many of their other people who work there in sending us. If you're involved in procurement, you would be asked to go and spend some time with great chefs. And I spent some time with Anton Moserman at the Dorchester, being taught how to properly cook fish. And that's what it's all about. It's you mustn't lose sight of it. And for those people who can't get to restaurants, if you can get restaurant quality fish from a retailer and you have a bit of confidence, because it's not hard to cook good fish, it's quick. And maybe that is the only tricky bit to it. It's easy to overcook. But if you're a little bit confident, seafood is not difficult to cook and highly nutritious. It's great food. We hopefully will see increase in consumption over time, because I think with climate change, and I'm sure you've come across the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, mapping out the future of the oceans, the future of employment, climate change, lots of impacts that we have on our world. Seafood has so many advantages over other types of protein that you might look at compared to red meat or even poultry, using less fresh water, using less land, being high in protein, good fats, low in carbohydrate. Nutritionally, it's very good food, quality food. And I think from a climate point of view, I hope we'll see more people trending towards seafood as an environmentally responsible choice, not only for the overfishing side of it, but just as good for the planet.
I think also maybe the fact that it's actually got a lower carbon footprint than was first realized or thought.
Yeah, there's a great scientist, Dr. Ray Hilborn at the University of Washington in Seattle, and he's done some fantastic work on comparing the climate impacts and environmental impacts of seafood compared to other proteins. And it's really surprising and impressive how good a food seafood is, how much better for the planet it is if you can consume it. And it's also better for you. You haven't got all of these highly saturated fats present that you might have in red meat, for example. So, there's no such thing as bad food, it's bad diets. So I wouldn't criticize anybody for enjoying a good juicy steak now and again, but I certainly think we could be eating more seafood than should be. The government's been recommending that for years: eat 2 portions a week, one of which should be oily. We're nowhere near that, certainly in the UK, certainly in the US, probably most developed world countries. We're not eating as much seafood as we should.
That's 100% correct as far as I'm concerned. I definitely think that. One of the things, going on from what you said, one of the things I did in my menu in the Captain's Galley in the restaurant was I put a page at the front welcoming people, and say, I don't know, I was getting the stage where uh, people had their preconceived ideas. They had their favorite seafood that they always got when they were on holiday or something like that. This idea, and I kind of got the feeling that people were walking up this ramp into the restaurant and with this idea what they were going to have, and if it wasn't in season, I wasn't going to have it on the menu. So they were going to be disappointed, even although they would have got a lovely choice of really fresh, good quality fish. they were disappointed because we hadn't got the dish that they were expecting. So I just put a wee paragraph in saying that, explaining that fish have eggs, they hatch eggs, and the spawning cycle, and before that happens, we want to leave them to let them contribute to future stocks, recover, and then and so we'll enjoy them in another day. And by doing that, you are contributing to the you're playing a part in contributing to the future stocks, the health of the fish stocks. And so many people just appreciate the fact that they realize by reading that small words that it's simple and makes sense. But the reason I did it was almost like saying, "Whoa, slow down! If it's not in season, I'm not going to have it."
Yeah, because as you said, they'll be disappointed. They'll probably blame you for it. Um, so, yeah, I don't know why we're so conservative about the fish that we eat. The top 5 species haven't changed much for decades. There's been a couple of exceptions. Monkfish, you probably remember, used to be sold as fake scampi or lobster bait. Now, obviously, it's a premium fish. Um, Tuna used to just be in a can, but now you can get it fresh, and what an amazing, eating quality that is, particularly raw as sushi and sashimi. But it hasn't really changed that much. We've still got our traditional favorites, and we could be more adventurous. And I've seen fishermen how it breaks their heart. They go out and risk their lives to catch this fish for us. We talk about farming separately, but from the wild capture side, and the technology of catching fish is not that selective. You're dragging a big sock. It's like somebody told me once the analogy would be from a helicopter dragging a net through a field of cows. Yeah, you're going to catch some cows, but you'll catch a whole lot of other beasties as well. And I know it breaks their heart to have to discard perfectly good quality fish, either because they're not allowed to land it because of quota or because there's no market for it. And I'm sure everybody would be helped by a broader selection of seafood in the restaurants. And then once people get used to eating in a restaurant by somebody who knows how to cook it, present it, and explain it to them, maybe they'll have the confidence to buy it from a fishmonger somewhere and try it at home.
Yeah, yeah. Uh, and yeah, totally with you on that one. And but it's just a cycle, the seasonal the seasonal cycle. But how do we break this? I what I class it as, we've got the what would you call it, the
Like
oh,
blinkers.
blinker,
But
sorry, aye, absolutely, blinkers. And
yeah.
we're not seeing anything other than cod and haddock, cod and place, say, in England, haddock and sole in Scotland, and nothing else matters. We've some one woman said to me, she came into the restaurant, looked at the menu, she says, "Thank goodness I can come to somewhere in Scotland, and there's something other than haddock and sole."
Mm, yeah, sure. More customers like that. But
Yeah,
honestly, I think it's this the it takes a brave person to buy something in a retailer that they haven't tried before. It's not cheap. Fish is not cheap option. I was looking at a counter here in the US, and sea bass, strangely enough, from Turkey. It was whole round. I had to gut it and scale it myself, and it was, let's say, in rough equivalent, say £6 a pound. I could have bought chicken for about a pound. Same chicken portions, skin on bone, bone in thighs, for example, maybe £1.50 a pound. So fish is not cheap. So you have to have some confidence in what you're going to do with it. So really, I think the onus, not the onus, but the opportunity is with the restaurants to say to customers to try something else. It's partly about labeling. It's partly about the name of the fish. Sometimes that can be a bit off-putting. But you could have something in a medley, a mixed seafood dish where you can bring something else into it that people might try mixed in with other things. And, that whatever it was tasted quite good, actually. I wouldn't have ordered a plate of it up front, but now I've tried it mixed with something else. Maybe I'll try that next time. But we have some great seafood to use. We have amazing farmers and fishermen producing the best fish in the world. And then you've got great restaurateurs, restaurants like yours, choosing the best week by week to put in front of their customers. So the missing link, if you like, is a little bit of education, a little bit of persuasion, and also trying to get customers a bit more likely to be adventurous to try something different. Because you can put good fish in front of people all day long, but you can't make them eat it unless they have a mind to. And I'm sure all retailers will have had their experience of finding an amazing quality seafood. My particular bête noire was Pacific halibut. I thought it was an amazing fish, much about a third the price of Atlantic halibut. Still good, white, flaky, firm meat, delicious. But unless you just passed it off as halibut, which of course is a bit of a risk because there's also Greenland stroke black halibut, which is nowhere near as good as eating quality as Atlantic white halibut. You risked people just saying, "Oh, Pacific halibut, is that the same?" Well, not quite, but it's very similar. No, I don't think so. We'll stick to the Atlantic one. And it's getting that education, making it worth their while to try it. More sampling, more opportunities to try without risk. And I think that's the secret. More education for younger people, maybe. So I think there's a bit of a mix of choices and persistence too. I think gradually younger people become more aware of better choices for the planet, and hopefully they'll see responsible choices, good choices in seafood as a part of their need and ambition to live in a more sustainable way.
Would you not think? Would you not say that the younger modern generation are more that way minded and health conscious as well?
I think so. Yes, I have two sons and a third stepson and a stepdaughter, all of whom are smart, world-wise, young people plugged into their social media, and I think all of them are concerned about the future of the planet. I think when you get to your and my time of life, we're still concerned, but it takes a different dimension when you're thinking, well, we're thinking what planet are we leaving our children to? What are we leaving our children in terms of the environment? Our children are ones who are going to have to live that for the next 50, 70 years. So I think it gives them a different focus. They are, I think, more. I do a lot of work for a couple of NGOs in sustainability. And when I look at the sort of people who work for those organizations, they're typically younger people in their 20s, or up to 30. They've joined it not because they want to earn a lot of money. They could have gone and done something corporate if they wanted to, but they have joined a non-profit, possibly a charity, working in sustainability because they want to see responsibly caught or farmed seafood promoted for the future and being made more available, and also that people who want to buy it know where to find it, know how to recognize it when they see it.
I don't know if you have any comments on it. Maybe I'm mistaken here, Andrew, but Australia, our youngest son is living in Australia, Sydney, Australia, and out visiting him. I must say it's the only place I have ever seen fish on a menu which says either like a barramundi or something like that, if it's the actual menu said whether it was farmed or wild, and I thought I like that.
Yeah, I think there's still a tendency to say it's wild if it's wild, and if it's not wild, in other words, if it's farmed, you don't say anything at all. I bought some smoked salmon, 2 packs of smoked salmon yesterday, and one said wild smoked salmon, the other one just said smoked salmon. It didn't say it was farmed. I probably could have looked at it in the fine print at the back, but it's not a selling message that it's farmed, which is a shame, because there's some great farm fish out there, and we seem to have found ourselves in a place where farming has a bad reputation. It's a young industry. Yep, mistakes were made early on, but a lot of progress has also been made now. And you can find great farm fish where they're actually making the environment better than it was before. So they are water treatment, for example, through a shrimp farm. Maybe the water coming out of the farm is cleaner in some ways than the water going in, suspended solids, for example. So there's a lot of really good fish farming in the world now, and it doesn't deserve this sort of legacy of negative press that keeps being regurgitated. I think people should find good, responsible farm seafood and buy it as an incentive for more farmers to become more responsible and adopt some of the best practice that is now readily available for them if they have a mind to farm that way.
I think you're hitting the nail right in the head as far as farmed is concerned. That we have to give credit. There is now responsible farmers who are trying hard to do a good job.
And you don't have to look far to see them. There's some fantastic companies in Scotland who really are going out of their way to work with their local communities, to grow great quality fish, to manage the environment in which they grow. I mean, farming is by necessity has some impact. You know, we've been ploughing up fields for centuries and not worrying too much about the wildlife that's displaced or the habitat that's been disrupted. You can come to the US and be on an airplane flying for hours over a single crop of whatever it is, soya, wheat, whatever, and very much monocultures. And rightly or wrongly, we're holding fish farming to a much higher bar because maybe it's come along later, and so we don't want to make the same mistakes. Fair enough. But fish farming certainly is contentious, but it can be done well. And if you look for things, you know, the eco labels like the Aquaculture Stewardship Council on a pack of salmon, you know that the environment has been monitored, that the water quality has been checked, that the animals have been cared for, that the feed is made responsibly. All those things that you don't have the time to go and find out for yourself, that somebody has checked that for you. And you see a badge on the pack and you think, okay, great. But Scotland, I always used to admire the salmon farmers in Scotland because, firstly, they don't have the easiest time dealing with the regulators because there are lots of little, pockets of government that you have to go and get somebody's blessing if you want to go and farm some fish. But once you've overcome all those hurdles and started to grow fish, the environment is fantastic. Whether it's West Coast, whether it's Orkney, whether it's Shetland, you have some amazing salmon being grown, and then that wonderful fish is then made into smoking or to fresh natural product. But yeah, it's some of the best in the world.
Well, there's a glowing example of that in Westray, one of the North Isles of Orkney, where there's less fishing boats there now. So obviously that meant less jobs. But the fish farms have been there's a lot of the ex-fishermen who maybe left the fishing, went to offshore to the oil industry or that, and a lot of them are now employed in the fish farm on the island. And there that is a place where they really do make a fantastic job. It's organic, and also they don't have any. They don't have to give any chemicals for sea lice because this where they're situated, the cages, they don't need any.
Yeah, and site selection is a huge factor in how healthy your fish are going to be and whether they're going to need medication or treatment during their life at some point. Um, if I'm sure I don't want to embarrass them, but a company I did some work with a little while ago, Scottish Sea Farms, I just like to give them the credit amongst others, but they're a great example of choosing great sites where there's good water quality, investing in an early vaccination of fish so the fish's immune system is protected against disease later on. And I know many of their sites, they've never had to use antibiotics because they don't have the threat from the environment. The fish aren't stressed. The fish aren't vulnerable to disease, and also they've been chosen because they're fit, healthy fish. They're fed well, and they're cared for by guys who are out on those cages every day in whatever weather, looking at the behavior, making sure that the fish are well. And as a result, you don't need to treat the fish. So this is one of the things that farming gets beaten up for, antibiotics. But there are many farms that have never used antibiotics because they have taken a healthy, proactive approach to how they want to raise their stock, and they invest in good husbandry.
Yeah, I mean, you could almost say in this country now there's no wild because there's not available. There's it's against the law to sell rod caught salmon, and I think that's a good idea. I think that's good because it takes somebody fishing on the river for salmon fishing. It shouldn't be for how many I'm going to catch and how much money I'm going to make. It should be for the love of being there and enjoying the environment and your hobby, your pastime, and yeah, be allowed to take one home for the pot, saying goes, but not how many can I kill to see how much money I can make. So I think that's a good rule.
Yeah, I agree, and I think rod fishing for salmon is a great sport. And for those that have the chance to do it, I wish them the continued success, as it were. But yeah, unfortunately, it's no longer a commercial catch to be able to market it as such. I have seen some pretty ropey examples of wild caught salmon that haven't been handled well, and they would have just better been returned to the water and hopefully maybe reproduce further. Now, the decline of wild salmon, very contentious area. You know, some people will blame it on farming, but there are declines in wild salmon on the east coast of Scotland where there's not been any salmon farming. So it's not salmon farming's fault. It's more, I think, about high seas mortality, about maybe juvenile salmon being caught up with mackerel catches on the high seas, maybe food supply, maybe climate change. There's probably a lot of factors that have led to a decline in wild salmon. I'm sorry. I mean, really, if you look at the big fisheries of the world on the Pacific side of North America, Alaska, British Columbia, those fisheries are significantly supported by hatchery release, where they're raising juveniles and releasing them into the rivers. And if they weren't farming fish as at least a juvenile stage and letting them go, I don't know how much of that wild. I'm sure there's a percentage somewhere. If I put my fishery science hat back on and went digging, I might be able to find out what percentage of that catch is now proportion of it is from hatchery and actually genuinely from wild reproductive stocks.
Yeah. See, when you said yourself there, you bought wild 2 packs yesterday,
Yeah,
and one of them was wild.
yeah.
Is that wouldn't be Atlantic? Is that coho or sockeye or something like that? It wouldn't be Atlantic halibut, would it?
Salmon? Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes.
a
The
smoked salmon you bought.
smoked
Sorry.
salmon. Yeah. The farmed one, yes, was an Atlantic species. The wild one would have been one of the Pacific. So it could have been coho, it could have been king, probably king because the oil level was a little higher.
Yeah. Do you? I've seen when I've been holidaying in Florida in the past, when our boys were younger. We used to get Spanish mackerel. Is that a species, or I don't come across that in this country?
No, it's more of a catch over here, and I have to confess I've not really got into the wet fish or fresh fish market in the US. But as you go further south, you get more exotic species like snappers and yellowtail. Uh, but in this part of the world, well, the states that I am in New England, it's actually very similar to the sort of fish you would be familiar with, seeing on your menu there. So there's cod, there's haddock, there's halibut. Um, Probably what we see here a little bit more is swordfish, because there's a fishery off the Grand Banks here. You probably remember that film, The Perfect Storm, and the books written around it, or actually the books came first, obviously, and then the film with George Clooney. And long lining for tunas, but also for swordfish. The tunas are coming back a little bit, the big bluefins, but swordfish is a fairly regular catch off the coast here. And if I go to a local retailer, nothing fancy, not a specialist fishmonger, the typical offer there would be haddock, salmon, maybe some cod, and then you'd have swordfish, halibut, couple of whole fish occasionally, depending on season. You might get some black bass, you might get some European sea bass. So there's a reasonable selection, but swordfish is quite a staple here, which maybe you're not seeing quite so much in Europe.
We don't see swordfish at all in this country. Never, I've never known it.
No, it's a good eating fish. You know, you cut it as a
Yeah,
steak, and it's very firm and meaty. Um, the bigger ones, if they start to accumulate a bit of mercury because they're right at the top of the food chain, so that mercury is bioaccumulating up from the little fish to the medium-sized fish, and then the big fish eats the medium-sized fish, and so on. But last time I looked, I think if you're eating swordfish less than 50 kilos total weight of the fish, they're not going to have any sort of level of mercury that would trouble you. And with a lot of these sort of contaminants that get talked about, you have to eat an awful lot of whatever is supposed to contain this particular contaminant to make any impact on your health. I mean, yeah, mercury is bad for you. Dioxins and PCBs are bad for you, but the levels are extremely low, and you'd have to eat a lot of whatever it is they're being found in to cause any sort of risk to you.
yeah. I thought you wrote that bit well in the on your book about the PSPs and
Yeah,
obviously
these pollutants. Yeah. Yeah, and that's the trouble. You know, people just want to hear the soundbite. They think, "Oh, it's contaminated. Don't want it." But I mean, you can find things like PCBs and dioxins in human breast milk. You can find these are environmental pollutants that have been with us for 50 years, maybe, and their presence is reducing because they've been banned for some time now. But the level of sensitivity of modern laboratory equipment is so good that you can detect these things down to parts per billion. Um, so to be able to say, well, it's not present, you used to be able to say, no, it's not there because it was below the limit of detection. It's harder to say now because that limit of detection has dropped by factors of 10 or hundreds with modern laboratory techniques. So, yeah, but it's just a bit of realism, you know. The vast majority of the benefits of eating seafood vastly outweigh the risks. And I think a scientist called, I was going to say Mondrian, but that's the artist, isn't it? Oh, it might come back to me. He calculated how many lives, in theory, had been lost through heart attacks. You remember there was a scare about farmed salmon, I think around 2004, about PCBs, dioxins, and the market dropped. A lot of people stopped eating farmed salmon and stopped having the benefits of the long chain omega-3s that were present in salmon. And he did some maths on the vulnerability to heart attack that probably caused across the population, and the number of people that probably died of heart attack as a result of not having omega-3s compared to the actual risk of the PCBs and dioxins that have been detected at these tiny, tiny levels. So it wasn't the best health decision, as it turned out, to stop eating farmed salmon back in the day.
Yeah, I know that at one stage the Faroese, they're great for eating the pilot whale, and they catch it and distribute it amongst their population. And they, for one while there, they stopped. It was a recommendation that eat people, elderly people, children, and pregnant mothers shouldn't eat it because of the mercury content. But that was very much thought that it was pollution that was the cause of that.
There is some organic mercury pollutant possible, but it's environmental, and as I say, it comes up through food chains. So the bigger fish are more at risk because it bioaccumulates. As one fish eats another, it takes on its pollutants, whatever it is, mercury amongst others. But I should talk about the Faroes and pilot whales. I remember visiting the Faroes, and wonderful place, very dramatic scenery and great fishing industry there. Lovely people. And I went there just after they'd stopped, just at the time when they were stopping this prohibition. They used to ban alcohol, you probably remember.
Yeah.
And if you're a visitor there, you'd have to go and sit in a curtained off part of the restaurant if you wanted to be drinking, because the locals couldn't have alcohol, which was a little bit unfair, but that was their regulations at the time. But anyway, I remember sitting on a plane reading this brochure. You come to the Faroes and talk about their culture. And I opened this brochure, and there was this picture of a pilot whale slaughter in one of their bays, where they drive the pilot whales into the bay, into the shallow water, and then have at them basically with knives and just try and kill the beasts. And you think, well, somebody who's visiting, not familiar, might find this a little bit off-putting. But you have to respect the fact that, as you read the article, that this is an important meat supply. These are islands which don't have a lot of grazing for cattle or sheep, and so good protein is hard to come by. And so this pilot whale, they thought were plentiful, and it was a local survival to get through the winter, to be able to put down enough of this meat for the winter from this resource as they saw it. But yeah, having the bay turned red with the blood of pilot whales is probably not the best advertisement for tourism I've ever seen.
I totally agree with that. I totally agree with everything you're saying, because although it's maybe not the best advertisement for them, in fairness to them as well, every part of the beast that's slaughtered is eaten. But also, as you say, it saw them through the winters, and it's not just something that was thought of in the spur of the moment. Let's try it. It's been going on for hundreds of years. And also, what I found fascinating in the Faroes, every single house, the garden, there's a drying shed. And never will I forget the day I was visiting a fisherman, and he insisted that as a welcome, he was handing me a piece of dried puffin that I had to eat, and he was within 2 feet of me, looking at eyeball to eyeball, so I couldn't even screw up my face if I didn't like it. So I just got a lump of dried puffin to stick in my mouth, and
Yeah,
but
they're a little bit fishy tasting. And I had a similar experience where we'd been to a fish factory and they said, "Oh, okay, thank you. Do you want to come on a little boat trip to see some of the islands, see the puffin colonies?" And yeah, great. So we jumped onto this little boat, went round to the cliffs, saw all the puffins skimming along the waves, little fish in their beaks going back to their nesting sites. And it was beautiful, a real experience and privilege to be able to see nature like that at first hand. So then they went round. Okay, we're going to have dinner now. Great. So we went round to the other side of the island, and some guys met us there at the quayside, and they had ropes and bags. And this island was shaped like a sort of a wedge of cheese. The cliff on one side and the slope on the other. And they went romping up the slope to what would have been the top of the cliff, hung these ropes over, shinnied down, and they started grabbing these puffins, breaking their necks, and throwing them into the bags on their back. And having just seen these beautiful birds flying around and nesting, and thinking, "Oh, how wonderful!" You then realize what was going to be for dinner. And so we had that meal in a local, like a town house, just like the civic house of the community. These birds were just plucked and roasted and laid on the plate, beak and feet and all. And bon appetit. Enjoy your dinner. And that's been one of the experiences of which I've had a few, I think, of traveling in the world of seafood, being somewhere where there's a local culture and might not be what you're used to, but it's certainly an experience. Well, I don't think I would rush back for roast puffin. I found them a little bit fishy to eat, but I've had worse, put it that way.
I'll tell you, the eating experience will be forever lasting with me as far as the Faroe Islands is concerned. I don't know if you noticed in your time there or with dealing with them, they have a great tradition when they're fishing the boats. They catch the smallest size. We call them baby codlings. The baby codlings. They tie two together by the tail and put them over the rail of the boat, and they're just left there and they dry in their own time, and it's an absolute delicacy. And I've had it on board boats and Faroe boats, and obviously they know how to cook it and handle it properly, and it really is delicious. This time it can be weeks old, but it's in the salt air, and there'll be sea lashing up in it as well. So it's and I was dealing with the Faroe Islands, so I was for must be 20 years. I was taking Faroe boats in. I was the first to start doing it. Actual fishing Faroe boats, fishing the Faroe Islands, not the UK, fishing the Faroe Islands and coming into Scrabster to land their fish. And I was handling their sails and all that. And this guy says to me, they're always very friendly, and "Oh, you must. And he gave me two of this codlings off the railing and said, "You take them home, and this is how to cook them and whatnot." And I obviously wasn't going to say, "No, thank you, I don't want them." So I thought, this is very good. And it was obviously early in the morning, and so I took the codlings and left when I was finished landing, getting the fish landed and graded and sorted and away in the trucks. So I went home to have a shower and my breakfast before I started the day job, and I put the two codlings in the sink, and what we had a back out almost like an outhouse or a washroom, and I put the codlings in the sink there. Had my shower, breakfast, whatnot, back to Scrapster. And in the middle of the morning, I got a phone call from my wife, Mary, and she says, "Did you do anything in the back porch today with in the washroom?" I says, "Why?" She says, "Well, whatever you've put there," she says, "Wick is the name of the town. You know, the Wick, that's where we lived at the time." She says, "I don't know what it is, but I think every blue bottle in a Wick is round our washroom."
Yeah. Yeah, I can picture it. Unfortunately, we work in an industry which is not the most aromatic. Um, and I remember as a young guy in my 20s working in a fish factory, catching the bus home, and two ladies were sitting in the seat ahead of me. And one turned to the other and started to sort of sniff the air and said, "Oh, somebody's got fish for tea." And yeah, that was me. That wasn't what I had in my bag. It was me.
Yes, I've heard that one many a time. You know, if I could just brush on the subject, going back to the wild fish, eh, I fully believe, I've not got any stats to tell me this, but I honestly believe myself the UK, the waters around the UK, have the biggest multi-species sea fishery in the world, or it must be coming very close to that.
Uh, from a commercial fishery, targeted fisheries, yes, I would agree. If you go for biodiversity, though, if you go to Thailand or Southeast Asia, the variety of fish they will catch is just phenomenal. And many of the species are small, and unfortunately, they're using quite fine mesh nets because they've been overfishing for some time, and they won't be targeting a particular fish. They will haul a net. They'll see what's in it. The larger fish, which they can segregate out for sale as named species, will go to a human consumption market. There'll be some sort of in the middle, which are random, bony fish or smaller sized, which they can't sell directly, and they'll go for surimi, this mashing up of fish to make protein, which forms things like crab sticks and other little snacks made of whitefish protein. And then you'll have the rest, which is still protein, but it's going to go for fish meal. They'll just shovel it into fish meal for pet food and animal feed, and then there'll be the sticks and sand and stones and the rest of it that will just get hosed back overboard. So the style of fishing is very different in the North Atlantic, Northern Hemisphere compared to Southeast Asia. But I think we do have a great diversity of species. We do have more targeted species that say, well, we're going to catch cod, and there might be a bit of a bycatch of something else, but typically you've got much more targeting of species than you would have in other parts of the world.
Yeah. One of the things I feel that we could take more advantage, going back to what we say about the blinkers on the cod and haddock, is if the fishermen were getting a better price for the lesser known species that we're speaking about, that makes up their income, and they could take less pressure on the main species. So there's a win-win for the consumer and the fisherman.
There is, and I've always found it to be feeling as though fishermen are in an impossible situation sometimes. If their price is going down, they have to fish more. They have to catch more to pay the bills, and it drives them into filling quotas earlier, and then they have to tie up their boats, and then they've got all that money invested in the boat, and it can't be working and earning money. It's a very inequitable system. Still, it's improved, but it's still difficult. And you think, well, if you were an investor, would you put money into a fishing boat? I don't know. You might find something safer, more predictable. You've got the weather to deal with. You've got the changes of regulation and quotas to deal with. You've got biomass influences beyond the control of any fisherman, which means that next year your quota might be cut by half. It's not your fault. It's just something that's happened maybe somewhere in the ecosystem that means there was a bad year class of fish coming into the fishery. And that volume's got to be cut down. So it's a tough way to earn a living. And I take my hat off to anybody who's done that. And I worked that out quite early on when I was studying fishing boats and naval architecture and gear technology, that I thought, I'll leave this to guys who are a lot braver than me to make a living at. But yeah, it's hard to get that economic mix right. And particularly when you've got this feature of, if there's money to be made, but in a particular fishery, more boats will come and try and catch that fish. And that shares the profit more ways. So each boat then earns less as a result. You have to go and capture more. And then the fishery is under pressure, and then the quotas get cut back to protect the stock, and then your boats have to go and move to something else. So the government really would be better at restricting capacity so that those fishermen who are working in a particular fishery can make an honest and good living out of it, afford to reinvest in their boats and their equipment. And so, yeah, the whole economic argument, we could talk for hours just about that. But we seem to have been protecting farmers on land for many years with subsidies and support, and seeing them as they protect the land and they're stewards of the land and they make sure it is maintained and cared for. Well, we should start seeing fishermen in the same way, stewards of the ocean, collecting data, helping fishery scientists make the right decisions, and not just expecting them to live or die by what comes up. Well, not live or die, God forbid, wrong words, but have a living or not, economic living or not, depending on what comes up in the net every day.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I hear a lot, obviously, from close friends and people I'm involved with, is when they're maybe it's in every fishing port, you'll get maybe a boat that it's maybe handed down from grandfather. He's out of the scene now. Father is maybe stepped back, and the sons are running the boat. Their crew, their skippers and engineers and things like that, and they're keeping the boat going. And they're investing. They've maybe built, on a number of occasions recently, there's been a lot of modernisation of the Scottish fleet, building new boats and investing huge sums of money. And they, they're one of the things they say was, well, why are we? What are we? Why is it not in our interest to fish sustainably, when our whole future investment, our families and their families, are so heavily involved in it?
Yeah, very true. And I think, again, fishermen have, there's a bit of an old-fashioned image in some quarters about they will just catch it before somebody else does. And I think that's just not true of the modern vessel owner, who probably has a mortgage, has finance, wants to reinvest, wants to see this as a long-term business. And absolutely, they want to see it as sustainable. So the value of the catch is protected. They don't want to see it as a mining operation where they just like the Olympic fishery style, where they'd go in as soon as the quota was filled. That's it. Everybody has to pull up nets and finish. There are still fisheries like that around the world, bonkers, then they can be over in a matter of a couple of weeks. But yeah, if you want to use your assets in a more financially sensible and economic way, you've got to have continuity rather than peaks and troughs of economic activity. So I think it's an industry which is trying to modernize, is making a lot of improvements, but it's still just seen as a little bit on the periphery. It should be a lot more central to government strategy than it is.
That's the concerning part for fishermen. And in recent times, there's been quota cuts, which has really impacted heavily on them. And yet there's no scientific evidence been taken. So a quota cut with no scientific evidence to justify it. And it's just been cut, which is a huge impact on them.
Yeah, and I sympathise with anyone who's in that situation where it's beyond their control. If a migratory stock like mackerel moving across between Scandinavia, across the top of Scotland towards Ireland, somebody has caught a lot of that fish before it's entered our territorial waters, or our UK territorial waters, and therefore UK fishermen don't get to catch as much as they might have done because somebody's beaten them to it. That's poor. But unfortunately, politics are often the problem with national interests competing over and above the interests of the overall fish and the public's diet, and seems to be almost an intractable problem, which is holding wild fisheries back all over the world. And I think our best hope for wild fish is that the stocks we have are protected. We continue to be able to enjoy them. Whether they're ever going to reach the levels of abundance they were 100 years ago is very unlikely. I think the high technology we have now is very good at catching fish. But let's hope we can regulate that, protect the stocks, allow fishermen who are licensed to fish to earn a good living, a reasonable living. But I think the growth overall in the consumption of seafood is probably will come from aquaculture rather than wild fish, because politics just seems to make it almost impossible for us to not only conserve but to grow wild fish stocks beyond where they are today.
Yeah, I find it quite fascinating talking to, there's a very well-known fisheries scientist in Icelandic, Jon Christensen, and I've spoken to people in the Faroe Islands, and when they're talking about stock assessment and that, they're very much talking about speak to fishermen, look at nature. That's what I find fascinating about you, Andrew. You're very much you take nature into the equation.
Yeah, and we've all seen that classic conflict of scientists. Oh, well, we've done this egg collection survey, or we've done this research trawl, and therefore we calculate that the biomass is this, and therefore, because of the reproductive ability of the fish, you should only take this amount per year as a quota. And the fishermen say, well, we've never seen so many fish jumping out of the water because the fishermen are very good at catching fish and scientists are not. So if the two of them go out trawling, the scientist is going to catch few and think, oh, not many fish in the water. The commercial fisherman is going to catch a lot of them because he or she knows where to look and is good at rigging their gear to catch them. So, history has been littered with scientific recommendations that have been based on faulty methodology. They've trawled in the wrong way. They've rigged their net in the wrong way. Having said that, the truth is probably somewhere in the middle, and really the ambition should be for the scientists and fishermen to work together. The fishermen collect data, the scientists interpret it and analyze it, and then make proposals. Fishermen say, yeah, okay, that makes sense or not, because the fishermen want that advice. They need, as you just said earlier, they want to be here in 20, 50 years' time. So they need that understanding of the reproductive ability of stocks, the ecosystem impacts, what's happening to that fishery. And they don't want to take out all of the reproductive ability of the stock by accident. I mean, look at what happened on the Grand Banks with cod. They said, yeah, lots of fish, until there weren't. And it's never come back. It's still, cod catches off the coast of Newfoundland are still, pitiful. In fact, it's been displaced by shrimp and scallops. Probably the shrimp are eating all the cod eggs. That's payback time for you.
Am I not right in thinking there's a huge increase in the lobster catch as well?
And lobster, yeah. They make more money out of shellfish now, whether it's scallop or clams or shrimp or lobster, than they did out of cod. But it was just a huge, painful transition to go through, and the government having to declare a moratorium on the cod fishery, which was at one point so abundant historically. You probably read these books, Mark Kolansky, yourself, about scooping up just in a basket in a rowboat. You didn't need a net.
It's a fantastic book, Cod.
Mm-hmm. It is.
Yeah.
It is. Great book.
When you're saying that, this young Christensen I mentioned, I was explaining to him one of the bones of contention with the British UK fishermen is that when they're stock assessment, they'll put the research ship out and trawl an area, and they'll do all the counts on what they catch, and then they go back to the same fishing ground. They go back to the same areas every time. And the fishermen are saying, look, that's not the way fish works. Fish move, and we move. We're areas where we caught them in a few years ago. We don't get them there now. It's not that they're not there. They're migrating, and we get them in other places. And so the research ships, the survey, they still keep going back to the same places. And I said to this guy, Jan Christensen, what do you think of that? And he says, with the way I would liken that, he says, it's the same if I was going to assess the stock of grouse, the wild bird. And he says, I would go at a certain time of the year to the top of a hill and fire 2 shots, and that with the pellets, I could go and find out, I could go and see how many birds I killed. And then, at the same time next year, I'll go to the top of the same hill, with the same gun, fire in the same direction, and see how many I kill this time.
Yeah. It's definitely a coming together is needed. And fishermen have quite rightly been a bit distrustful of science, and maybe getting better collaboration between those two bodies, I think, would benefit everybody.
I think that's the important thing, that they talk. I'm not saying the fishermen are everything, and fishermen would be happy to be just included and spoken, because it's their, they're in that environment more than anybody else, and they understand the environment more. An interesting thing I had yesterday, Andrew, with a podcast with a girl doing a lot of work in the west coast of Scotland on seaweed. And one of the things she said that they're looking at now and taking further, they're using seaweed and putting it, like a garden, they do buddy planting, where they would plants that maybe would help another plant grow, or divert the flies that would affect a plant. And they're doing that with seaweed, and they've got seaweed growing alongside mussel beds and oyster beds, and the beasties and different life that's coming off the seaweed. shellfish, the oysters are feeding on it, and it's got very positive results. I think that's fantastic. But one of the other things which I thought was really interesting was that they're doing commercial tests with one farm in the island of Mull in the west coast of Scotland is doing with they're using seaweed in pig farms. And I just thought, another bone of contention with our fishermen is there's big Danish vessels come over to I'm sure you maybe had experience of it. They come over to the east coast of the UK and mostly in the sort of northeast of England and that waters and fish for sand eels for industrial scale fishing for their pig farms. And what the UK fishermen feel is a bone of contention. That's food that's fish food. And how much better that would be if they could use seaweed and leave maybe that, who's to know, that would help the wild stocks.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at judging sustainability of any fishery, you very much have to look at not just what the stock can sustain in terms of harvest every year, but also what else is dependent on that stock and how whatever take commercial fishing extracts from that fishery, the impact on others. So krill would be another one, the impact on cetaceans, whales and dolphins, seabirds, particularly for something like sand eels. As many populations of seabirds are reliant on sand eels. So yeah, when you start looking at true sustainability or outside just the fishery science of it, you really have to consider all these other ecosystem impacts as well. And I could see how there would be a concern about whatever the purpose, whatever the utilization of the catch is secondary really, but how the ecosystem is impacted by that take. Maybe the sand eel survive, but are you taking food away from some other, maybe endangered marine animal that was reliant on that? And maybe it's the only thing that particular animal eats. So reducing the availability of that particular fish that you've just caught for something else may badly impact another marine animal. So Jim, I need to wrap up soon. I've got a doctor's appointment in half an hour, so time to move on, I'm afraid. But it's been a fantastic conversation. I feel we could talk for another hour easily.
Quite easily we could, but I'll go for second best, and I'll just carry on with your book instead.
Okay. Well, can you let me know how I can hear this podcast once you've edited it, where it will be published? Because friends and family, I'm sure, would love to listen in on it.
Yeah, and maybe who's to say in the near future we could maybe get back together with somebody else alongside and take it a stage further.
Yeah, sure. I love talking about seafood, so there's lots to talk about.
But I have to say again, repeat myself, I like the level that you've with your book. It's not a scientist book. It's not there's a science aspect in it, but I think it's well done. It's really, really clever, and I think it's I'm 72. My father was a fisherman, and my uncles, cousins, they were all fishermen. We're from a fishing background, and I can really relate to everything that you say. I think it's fantastic. Well done.
That's very kind. I really appreciate it. So coming from you with a lifetime experience in the industry and running a very successful restaurant, that's praise indeed. So thank you. And yeah, I did try and write it from a seafood lover's point of view. I tried to write it for people who enjoy seafood, want to know, like the equivalent of reading the back of the wine bottle, that sort of person who wants to know a little bit more about it. You might be an amateur chef or a professional chef, or you might just be interested. But I didn't want to make it too technical. I wanted to make it quite informal and readable. And if that's how it's come across, then I'm thrilled. Thank you.
Well, it worked.
Good.
resuming work.
Good.
Thank you so much for your time with us. It's been really, really interesting. Thank you. And I'll definitely let you know where and when you can pick up the podcast.
That'd be great. And it's been a pleasure talking to you, Jim. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you for listening to Seafood Matters podcast. You can subscribe and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. You can join me on Instagram and Facebook by searching for @Seafood Matters Podcast. If you have any questions or episode suggestions, please email me at jim@seafoodmatterspodcast.com or get in touch through my website, seafoodmatterspodcast.com.